I'm old. I'll start out with that. I celebrated a birthday yesterday, but I won't go into that level of detail,
Oh my
uh,
God.
except
Well,
to say that
happy
I'm
belated
old.
birthday.
But I went to law school and I graduated and I had no idea what I wanted to do when I grew up. Um, they, I was with a very small Wall Street firm that gave me tax work and real estate work and a little bit of litigation and a little bit of this and that. And frankly, I didn't like any of it. And I was beginning to scratch my head saying, what have I gotten myself into? When somebody gave me an SEC filing to work on, of course, the SEC filings in those days were tiny compared to what companies file now. But I said, gee, I kind of like this stuff. It's a combination of writing, it's thorough, you're telling a story, um, you're trying to communicate with people, and the rest, as they say, is history. Uh, I went into an in-house position very shortly after that, and I stayed in-house at a bunch of companies for the bulk of my career, actually from the 1970s until, excuse me, 2000, when I joined what is now my current law firm, Gunster in Florida. And then after being in Gunster for 2 years, I moved back to New York and went back in-house for another 10 years. So a lot of time in-house, a lot of time spent working with boards, mostly in the large cap space, but not entirely. And one of the things I've learned over and over again is that the large cap space is very, very different from the small caps and even the mid caps. Um, different radar screens. Smaller companies tend not to be on them. The last company that I worked for in-house was Pfizer, and obviously a company very much in the public eye and very much in the eye of the institutional investors that own significant chunks of the stock. Um, I guess as an outgrowth of my work in the SEC area and also working with the boards of the companies that I worked for, I became increasingly fascinated with corporate governance. And I think, in terms of my legal passions, that's really my true love now. I am and always will be a securities lawyer, but governance has taken over as the driving force in what I do. And I love it. It's crazy. It's in the news every day. You can't escape it. And it keeps changing. So it keeps me young, even though I'm old. We came full circle there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that resonates on so many levels because the space that where I'm at as a VC, a lot of times it's a maybe completely different spectrum from what you used to in terms of experience and the size of the companies. But I would imagine certain issues and challenges that we face in the boards of the companies are relatively similar. And the stage where we invest is usually early stage, pre-Series A. And there's a lot of problems and challenges that we inherit as investors. When we invest into the company, it's high potential, amazing leadership team, amazing management team, great revenue traction and growth year over year. But there's always that kind of one denominator that comes up when it comes to just the overall structure and design of the board of these companies, because a lot of times the management and the leadership of the company, that's not at the top of their minds. That's not their top priority. It's just happened by default, especially early stages. You have to operate, move 0 to 1 at the speed of light. And you're not thinking about, if I add this person and that person to my board, are they going to be of value? Which brings me to one of the questions that comes up a lot in our board director masterminds is around as a new board member, as a new board advisor, board director of a company, you're coming in fresh, but there is some type of a culture, some type of an environment that's already some type of a DNA that's already been formed at the board of that company. And not every board member is good at essentially challenging the status quo of the existing setup of a board. Maybe there's not a lot of propensity either to come in and ruffle the feathers and just start asking the tough questions, and where you have the full board table who are essentially on the side of the CEO of the company. Maybe share some strategies in your experience, what has worked well for you in the past as you've been, involved with boards of various size. It's a delicate area, and essentially, what are some of the tips and maybe practices that you employ yourself when you join the boards of the companies?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it also sort of encapsulates my career because, as I said, even though I started out working and worked most of my career at large caps, you look back at the boards of even big companies back in the 70s and 80s, they were much more similar to the boards of small caps now, in that they weren't expected to ask questions. I was literally at board meetings where a director was asking a question that challenged the CEO, and I could almost see the wheels turning in the CEO's head saying, uh-oh, got to get rid of this guy. He's asking too many questions. Um, that really doesn't happen, much in my experience, at least at the large caps, but because they're too visible. I used the term radar screen before. You know, a director leaving the board too soon can be a danger sign that investors want to know more about. So even the most imperial CEOs think twice before they take a step like that. But as you say, in the small cap space, aside from the fact that very frequently the founders, the CEOs, are much more concerned with, you know, being able to meet payroll the next week or coming up with the latest iteration of their software than they are with dealing with the board. Um, they also just don't understand necessarily what the board is all about. But to get back to your question, I think, if we can posit that even the CEOs of the founders of startups want to have a board that can really help them, there are steps that they can take to make the directors feel comfortable in challenging management, at least asking questions about management. You see this at large cap companies, and it does filter down into small cap companies. First of all, maybe it goes without saying, but choosing your directors carefully.
Yeah.
Really thinking through the role of the director at your company, what skills those persons need to have, and frankly, the kind of personality you want them to have. But it's all about the value add. What value can this person or that person add to the board? And then once the board, the decision to have this person join the board is made, to facilitate that person getting up to speed quickly by things like a good onboarding program. And again, it's tough for a small cap when there are so many competing priorities, but having a good onboarding program
Mhm.
can be a really good asset in getting a great director up to speed right away. Some of the techniques that boards use and use increasingly include having a mentor or a buddy system. It's called different things at different companies.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, a few years back, buddy systems or mentors were used primarily for women and other underrepresented constituencies on boards to sort of make them feel at home. But increasingly, the buddy system or a mentoring system is used for all new directors, so that the new director can go to a fellow director and say, look, I really didn't understand the discussion about X, but I don't want to sit there and disrupt the board meeting. What's the best way of bringing this up? You've dealt with the CEO. How can I go about making sure that I don't, piss him or her off, and ask the question in a respectful way? And if the buddy system works well, the mentor will really help that person to become a better director, to fit in with the culture of the board, and to do the right job of balancing support and skepticism, which I really do think is the hardest thing for any board member to do. You have to be a cheerleader, but you have to be able to put away your pom-poms
Mhm.
and ask tough questions when it's called for. And that can be very difficult to do, particularly when egos are involved. So having that kind of buddy system can really be helpful. You should also make sure, whether you're on the director side or the management side, that the materials you're giving the board are good. If the board isn't satisfied with those materials, it should speak up. And similarly, management has a right to expect that when board materials are given out, that the board pays attention to them.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
there are mutual expectations on both sides, and the best way to address them is to make those expectations clear at the outset.
Uh-huh. Yeah, the buddy system, and essentially, if I was to summarize that, it really boils down to essentially treating that as a new employee, as you would a new employee joining the
Yeah.
organization. Well, the onboarding process is of utmost importance. It's a make it or break it because it really establishes all of the, essentially ground rules for engagement and things like that, and just brings, a completely new person into an existing culture. That's never easy. That's never easy.
No, it's not. It's not at all. And I think when you couple that with the fact that, you know, even the best directors are kind of sitting on the fence, do I criticize? Do I support?
Yeah.
Um, how many questions do I ask? It really is a challenging situation.
Mhm. Yeah, and brings me to another point when we talk about just the overall responsibilities of the board directors, board members. You know what are they called? The act of the fiduciary response, the act of the duty of loyalty and duty of care. Those are the words that I was trying to come up.
Right, right.
Those are
I think about those in my sleep.
yeah, exactly. So the duty of care, duty of loyalty, and there's a lot of gray lines between the definitions of those. But when it comes to selecting the right board members for your organization, especially that interview process, it's a two-way street, right? It's an opportunity for the management of the company to get to know the potential member, and it's also an opportunity for the board director to gauge whether that's a good fit. Maybe speak a little bit further about your experience during the interview processes. Maybe what are some of the questions that you like to ask the CEO of the company or the actual board of the company before you join? And what do you look for in the responses when you
Yeah,
go through the rounds of these
yeah.
interviews?
I think the first thing is that you ought to have done your homework. I
Mhm.
mean, I know that goes without saying, but I figured I ought to say it anyway. The other thing I think to keep in mind, and I've seen this when I've taken new jobs, um, you have to understand that due diligence is not a perfect science. You can ask all the right questions, you can do your homework thoroughly, but you may not necessarily get a feel for how things really work. Somebody once told me that if due diligence were a perfect science, you wouldn't need litigators. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't tell my litigation partners that I said that, but there's a lot of chemistry involved, and I think that, excuse me, in the interview process, I think it's a combination of trying to get your arms around what what the management team envisions for the strategic direction of the company over the medium to long term. Um, and that in itself is a very difficult thing to define because these days, long term is like an hour. The
Yeah.
world is changing so rapidly, and developments can arise out of no place so rapidly. But trying to get management's handle on where and how they want to grow and expand. And hopefully some of the materials that are given as part of the onboarding process, the orientation process, will answer that question. But fleshing that out is really important. But I think in a way, the most important aspect of it is trying to suss out the chemistry of the individuals. How they react to tough questions. I remember I was interviewing for a company, and I had read their 10K, and I thought the 10K frankly stunk or stank. I don't know what the past tense version of stink is, but it did. Um, it was a multi-industry company, and they didn't tell a cohesive story about why the company was in the industries it was, and how they expected them to create synergies. It was just kind of, we do this and we do this and we do this.
Yeah.
So when I interviewed, I asked the general counsel, if I were to come in and revamp this 10K to really reflect what I think the strengths of this multi-industry company are, how would my desire for change be addressed? Would people be comfortable with it?
Yeah.
And his response was, and he was a really smart guy. His response was, well, if you're going to change something, you better be right. And
Mm.
I said, I don't mean any disrespect, but does that mean that if I'm not changing anything, I don't have to be right? And I figured that I thought about it in retrospect, and I said, that either sealed the deal or would have gotten me kicked out the door. But I think in a way, it's a good question for a director to ask.
Mhm.
What's your reaction to change, to
Yeah.
constructive criticism? Bearing in mind that I only want this company to do well, but we may have different views about how that is,
Mhm.
how we get there, and
Yeah.
really sensing what the CEO, founder, other members of management react to that. When I speak to people who want to join boards, well, how will I know if it's a good board? And I said, well, you never know. And that's why due diligence isn't the perfect science.
Mhm.
But, to create, um, to go to one extreme, if you're sitting in a room with the management team and you feel like, it must have felt to sit in a room with Adolf Hitler and Joe Stalin, maybe that's not the board for you. You-
Probably not.
You're going
The
to be spending a lot of time with these people and maybe dealing with very stressful situations. So feel free to talk about the personality, ask them about the culture, ask them how they respond to change, how they respond to criticism. And, in trying to do your due diligence outside of that interview to try to get a handle on how those people will react. I mean, I've seen founders of great startup companies, but their egos are so fragile,
Yeah.
uh, that, even asking a question is taken as a criticism. And
Mhm.
again, as a friend of mine whom you've met, I won't mention his name, said to me at one point, why would you want to join a board when the one thing that a board is supposed to do, which is govern, it can't do,
Yeah.
because management won't let it.
Mhm. That's tough. That's tough. And you said something that stood out when it comes to spending a lot of time together, because what I had faced as I talked to, executives of companies various size on, on daily basis, whether that's from my fund or whether that's managing our portfolio companies or even talking about the boards of the companies. And there's also sometimes a misconception on just the level of engagement and the level of effort that takes to serve on the company board. And I'm talking about the full-fledged, compensated board seats, that, not necessarily the not-for-profit, maybe that's a little bit, there's different dynamics there. But as we talk about these types of boards, especially in early stages of the company, there's probably some rules that are to be broken when it comes to just the overall board structure and the board organization. But in general, it takes a lot of effort, energy, and resources to be on these boards.
Yeah. I mean, every study that I've ever seen tells me that, number one, the amount of time that a board member has to devote to being on that board
Mhm.
goes up every year.
Yeah,
But those studies have also always shown that the amount of time you spend outside of the boardroom is much greater than the amount of time you spend in the boardroom. Unfortunately, you don't see a lot of studies or surveys about startup companies and small cap companies.
yeah.
But I would hazard a guess that the disconnect between in the boardroom and out of the boardroom is even greater for
But
startups and small caps, because I don't want to be overly melodramatic. I thought I disconnected that, or melodramatic at all. But when you're on the board of an established company, you really are engaged much more in the pure oversight function
yeah,
of the company. When you're on the board of a startup, they need help. And it's much more, despite all the theories about, what is oversight, noses in, fingers out. I mean, that's true for many companies, but it's not as true for startups. When the company needs, ongoing financing, it's a capital hungry
yeah,
enterprise. As a board member, you are going to be expected, and rightfully so, to help that company raise capital.
absolutely.
Um,
And it's a
when
challenge I
you're,
deal with on a daily basis.
in a larger company, you're delegating that to the CFO or the treasurer or somebody else.
Yeah,
But in a small company, you may have been brought on that board because you have connections to the financial community, and you're going to be expected to use those connections to help the company raise money. it's not just limited to capital raising. It's all the things that a startup company needs, but by definition doesn't have in its management team yet.
Mhm.
And even if it has it, it doesn't have the staffing or the maturity to do all those things right away. So it's I think it's not wrong to say that the board's role is oversight, but
Mhm.
I think in a smaller company, there's a lot of hands-on in addition to the oversight role. And therefore, that's why I say that the amount of time that you're spending outside of the boardroom in a small cap company or a startup is probably much greater than it is for a mature company.
Yeah, you're absolutely right when it comes to those differences, because at the end of the day, you know, those early stages, you know, due to limited resources and everything in the capacity of there's, you know, no time availability whatsoever. The board members, like you said, most of your time is going to be spent outside of the actual boardroom, just being the strategic advisor to the company
Yeah.
and leveraging as much of your own resources as you can to be of value. Which brings me to the further point when it comes to, you know, I also see a lot of boards that deal with, or maybe don't necessarily want to deal with underperforming board members, and they just maybe let it sit, because it's a very delicate, it's a very sensitive issue, because a lot of times these board directors, you know, highly, you know, people of high status as well. What are some of the things that you had seen that companies do right when it comes to, you know, identifying that there is a disconnect, identifying that there are challenges, and acting on that quick, essentially being able to either replace that particular underperforming board member, or maybe go through a series of activities that will help them come up to speed. Share some maybe case studies from the boardrooms
Yeah.
where you have been part
Well,
of.
first of all, that is a question that applies to companies of all shapes and sizes. We've been talking about some distinctions between startups and mature companies.
Yeah.
I think in my experience, most companies, large, small, medium, all, we're back to the word stink. They all stink at that.
Right.
And part of the problem, I think, is education. We American corporations grew up, so to speak, in an era where being a board was like being appointed to the Supreme Court. It's like it was a lifetime job. They took you out, horizontally. And that's just not the case. I mean, there are people now who are saying that shouldn't be the case for the Supreme Court, but that's another discussion. Um, so what's happened over time is that boards, and again, all shapes and sizes of companies,
Mhm.
they've used things like age limits or term limits to it seems to me there are lazy ways out of dealing with unperforming board members. I mean, I've seen board members who have served for 20 years in their 80s who are much more effective as board members than people who are in their 40s and have just joined.
Mhm.
But I can also cite people who are in their 20s and have just joined who are greater than some people who are in their 70s and have been on the board forever. It's really there's no hard and fast rule. And by the way, to the extent that any board has that an age requirement or a tenure requirement, um, they always provide for waivers of those requirements, and that's a mess. I mean, I won't mention the company, but one of the companies for which I worked had a board member that they decided to keep on for an extra year, despite the fact that he had gone over the age limit.
Mhm.
Um, they made up a reason why, and whatever. The
Mhm.
next year, they had somebody else bump up against the limit, and they didn't waive it for that director.
Mhm.
And he was angry. He was very upset. He felt that it was a slight, a criticism of his function as a board.
Mhm.
Um, so getting back to your question, because I told you what not to do or what I think shouldn't be done, I think you really have to explain to the board that, especially in a small company where things are changing so rapidly, this is not intended to be a lifetime tenure.
Mhm.
You know, we have certain needs now. The company's going to change. Those needs are going to change. If we feel that we need an expertise or a skill set other than the one you have, please don't be offended if we say, you've done a great job. It's time for you to go. You wouldn't say it that crudely, but try to try to engage in some education that this is not a lifetime position. The
Mhm.
other thing that I think is really helpful, and I think this is true even for smaller companies, have some kind of rudimentary board assessment pretty regularly.
Mhm.
Um, because you'll get, if you do it right, you'll understand that, directors 1 through 4 think director 5 isn't pulling his or her weight. So it's not, number one, it's not on just the CEO to say, hey, Shirley or Fred, you're out. It's the verdict of the other directors. Uh, and if you have that robust system of board assessments, and you can make it as elaborate or as simple-minded as you want, it's never to find fault or blame. It's just, we need somebody who has different skills than you do. Um, there are occasions, obviously, where somebody just isn't pulling his weight, isn't reading the materials, doesn't ask questions. That's a slightly different situation. But again, having some kind of rudimentary or maybe even more sophisticated board assessment process is a good idea.
Yeah.
You and I have discussed, John, that I don't feel strongly about having a separate CEO and chair
Yeah.
role. Either way, I've seen it work. I've seen it be a disaster. So I don't think there's any magic to that.
Mhm.
But to the extent that the CEO, if he or she is the chair, can have another sort of senior director who is a consigliere and can be used by the CEO to say to his or her consigliere, hey, we have this director, Mr. Ms. X. I think the consensus is that she is not performing up to par.
Yeah.
Um, can you speak to him?
Mhm.
Because then it takes it out of the realm of the CEO. It's one director talking to another. So again, I'm not going to advocate for the separation of the CEO and chair spots, but I think having somebody who can sort of unofficially assume the role of senior director in a small company can be very helpful from that perspective, can really help the CEO. So the CEO isn't getting involved in personality conflicts and things of that nature.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very interesting topic that you bring up. It comes up all the time in every single board director masterminds that we facilitate. When it comes to the separation of the actual duties, whether the CEO should always be the chairman or chairwoman, or the vice versa. And I always say I hate that answer myself, but it really depends. It depends on the structure, it depends on the stage of the company. There's a lot of variables. But at
I
the end of the day,
I do agree.
when it comes to running an effective board meeting, I've seen companies do a great job. I've seen companies do a really, really bad job. And as you've mentioned several times, a lot of that depends on what goes on outside of the boardroom. And what I mean by that is also the amount of prep work that goes on, before the actual board meeting, where, you know, the best board meetings that I've been part of is there is no PowerPoint, there is no status report, where the CEO actually is not spending their time bringing the board members up to speed on what's been happening. I think it goes without saying that to me is a rudimentary, thing that needs to happen. And also when it comes to board members coming prepared to these board meetings, everyone is full of ideas. Everyone. It just drives me nuts when everyone's just sitting around the table and throwing a bunch of ideas at the CEO of the company and with no concrete actions. Especially when it comes to hiring. Hiring and retaining the best talent is the hardest job of every CEO. And I've been in a board meeting recently where the company was struggling to hire a great senior level executive. And everyone's just full of ideas. Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Why don't you do this? And one really prime example of that was someone, a peer who was also part of the board, actually coming to the board meeting prepared with a fully vetted several resumes for particular candidates, saying, look, I've already pre-screened some of them, and these are my top candidates. Why don't you take that to the next level? That just blew my mind. I said, this is another level of what it takes to be an effective board member. What are some of the stories that you have seen when it comes to poorly run board meetings, or some that actually have been, very productive?
Well, I'm with you on, I call it murder by PowerPoint, where you have, and I have to be careful here because I've told you that the slide deck that you showed for the masterminds program is fantastic.
Yeah.
But what I loved about it was,
My PowerPoint, but then I use.
but you didn't limit the discussion to what was on your PowerPoint. And I've been to so many board meetings,
Yeah.
especially where they bring in somebody other than the CEO. They bring in, somebody who's lower down in the hierarchy, who
Yeah.
comes in, and he or she stands there and just reads off slide after slide after slide, and I just want to go shoot myself. So that requires homework on the part of the management team. I mean, you may want to show PowerPoints, but you have to be super careful, um, and make it clear that, this is not, I'm an opera fan, and one of the expressions they use about opera singers who are not good actors is that all they do is stand and deliver. Um, so you want to make sure that your management presenters are not just standing and delivering. If they use a PowerPoint, they need to focus on 2 or 3 slides at most that are designed to provoke discussion,
Yeah.
because that's where the values begin to come out, where the board members are forced, not that they need to be forced, but they're you're facilitating their engagement.
Mhm.
The other thing that CEOs sometimes find it hard to do, excuse me, but I think it's really important, is to use the board members for what board members can be used for, which is to say, you've got a board meeting coming up. Make sure you make the rounds of your board members a couple of weeks before the meeting and say, no, don't do it in a group, individual calls. And I know it's time consuming, but I call you, John, you're on my board. And I say, hey, John, these are the 5 things that we're planning to discuss at every board meeting. I want to make sure I understand your point of view before we just sit there and blurt it out to everybody.
Yeah.
Well, if that happens with each of the directors, the CEO, by the time she walks into the board meeting, is going to have a pretty good idea of where the board wants to come out. And I attended a board meeting last week that was an example of how that doesn't work when it doesn't happen. Somebody came to the board meeting prepared to talk about making a new hire.
Mhm.
And it was a complete free for all. What's the hourly rate? How is that person going to handle the other? This should have all been discussed beforehand. So it was a concise presentation. Let people think about it, come back at the next board meeting, and make a decision after management has had those discussions. I think another problem that I see a lot of companies doing, and this is very true in the nonprofit world, we have to make a decision today. Really? And it also touches upon the duty of due care,
Yeah.
because one of the conditions that you need to satisfy to fulfill the duty of due care is making sure you take enough time to reach a reasonable decision. We all know haste makes waste. There are lots of different sayings about that. You make a decision rather, too quickly based on incomplete information, there's a higher chance it's going to be the bad decision.
Mhm.
But I've seen this, especially in non-for-profits, but I've also seen it at large and small companies alike.
Yeah.
We're teeing this up for consideration. Let me have your thoughts. Let the board discuss it. We'll come back to the next board meeting with a proposal. It's so rare that decisions need to be made right then and there. It happens, but save it for when it needs to be done, as
Yeah.
opposed to making sure you have to have a decision right away.
Absolutely.
We're almost better equipped to deal with crises than we are with
Yeah, you're right.
decisions that can be
And that's
made in a
usually a
lot
sign of
fashion.
board being disorganized, where items like that come up and we have to make a decision right now. To me, that doesn't make a lot of sense. It means that whoever was responsible for having that decision made didn't do enough of a prep work.
Yeah, and I mean, it's aside from the fact that it calls into question whether the duty of care is being properly carried out.
Yeah.
It's just, I've been on small nonprofit organization boards where, we've been told we have to expand the board by 1/6.
Hmm.
It's like, what? Why does that have to happen today? You
Right.
know, is this the right person? It's
Yeah.
just the duty of care. I don't want to minimize it, but it's not all that hard to satisfy.
Mhm.
If you look at the legal definition of the duty of care, it's that the person takes the amount of time, information, etc., that an ordinary, reasonable person would take to make that decision.
Yeah.
It's not all that hard to do. The duty of loyalty can get more complex,
Mhm.
especially under Delaware law, where the duty of loyalty is undivided,
Mhm.
and where you have VCs and PE firms that are selecting people to represent them on a board.
Yeah.
Loyalty can be a little bit more challenging to parse out there, but the duty of care really isn't that hard. Don't make it any harder than it needs to be.
Yeah, and I love what you said about that type of prep work that goes on before the actual board meeting. We call that a roadshow,
Yeah,
where you have these one-on-one conversations, and you know exactly what you're walking into. There's never any surprise. You know everybody's opinion. You know everybody's stands on particular items. So that's, I think, you nail it on the head when it comes to just rudimentary things that need to happen outside of the boardroom, especially when it comes to preparation work. The other very actively discussed topic in a lot of the, not only the board masterminds that I facilitate, but overall my conversations with executives is finding these board opportunities, right? There's a lot of interest to join the boards of the companies. I get that. There's a prestige, there's credibility, there's a lot of, things that go along with that. But it also, it's almost like starting a brand new career. It's never okay, I'm just gonna put it on my LinkedIn, and I'm just gonna get companies lined up outside my door, offering me, an opportunity to join on the boards. Never works that way. It takes a lot of hustle, it takes a lot of prep work, and it takes a lot of branding for you as a professional to build that brand. And building the brand is never overnight. So those are conversations I have, on an ongoing basis with a lot of executives who really are thinking way in advance. I reached the top of my career as an executive, and now I'm looking to leverage that experience to move onto the boards of the companies. So to me, that makes a lot of sense, starting way in advance. But also, there's a lot that don't have that leverage, don't have that advantage, and they're basically saying, "Look, I'm in this particular position now. I almost need to find these board opportunities." What are your thoughts on that? How did you go about? Obviously, you've been very successful in that space. What worked well for you? What has not?
yeah. I mean, I hate to use my own experience as a guidepost, but I guess I don't have a whole lot besides that. I think the secret of it is networking. Um, I've certainly attended any number of programs where search firms have spoken, and I respect the job that search firms do. But I've found in my experience that a candidate sending his or her board bio
Mhm.
to the search firm is not likely to hear from that search firm again. I don't know why it is, but if you send them your information, it's like an automatic disqualification.
Because there's like 8,000 other resumes.
And they will tell you that no, we save all these board by, maybe they do, but I'm not going to ask where they save them. Um, you know, and even if they do save them, if when you write, you are not what they're looking for at that moment, it's really easy to forget you. So what I would say is, aside from spending some money on postage or email and and your time, it's not it's not bad to send your information to the search firms. Just don't expect very much from it. And
Yeah.
if you are going to send it to the search firm, make sure you've got the right person, and don't make it a one-shot deal. If you're speaking on a panel or a podcast, if you publish an article, make sure they know about that, because that gives you a level of preeminence that they might just be interested in.
Mhm.
But again, coming back to the basics, I think the most important thing you can do is to network. Um, and I see it, unfortunately, I see it particularly in women. Um, they're afraid to be out there and say, I want to be on a board.
Mhm.
Um, if you're networking, tell people, I'm at a point in my career now where I think that I would be a good board member.
Yeah.
Hang on just one second, John. I want to dish this call.
Mhm.
I want to be a board member. Um, don't be afraid to say it. And you can find people who can help you achieve that goal in all sorts of places. I've heard
Mhm.
people say, joining a nonprofit board isn't a great way to get a role on a for-profit board. But especially outside of, the cities like New York and San Francisco and so on and so forth. I mean, I lived in New York for most of my life. And if you want to get on a good nonprofit board there, you have to fork over a lot of money. That's not true in most other areas. You may have to make a donation, but it's not your life savings. Um, but if there's a bank president
Yeah,
on that nonprofit board, if there's another local,
exactly.
figure of industry, um, it's a great way to meet people. And if you don't tell those people, hey, I want to be on a board, they're never going to consider you for that. The other thing, maybe I'm doing it in reverse, but I think maybe the most important thing is to carefully consider what your value add is
Yeah, exactly.
to to a
Yeah,
because when you say to that person, I want to be on a board, if that person is interested and says, great, what unique skills do you have? What can you really contribute to the board? If you sit there going, oh, well, humana, they may lose interest. And John, I do work for the Deloitte Center for Board Effectiveness. And one of the things we do is conduct programs in preparing board bios.
mhm.
And I was looking at one today in anticipation of an upcoming program. And I looked over the board bio of a woman who clearly has talent. Um, but you read this deep, deep dive one-page board bio, and you get to the end of it and you say, okay, she's got a great career. I don't see where her value add is.
Right, right.
It can't be everything. You can't be all things to all people. Um,
Yeah.
but really focus on that. I mean, I see people who are qualified as audit committee financial experts,
Mm,
which companies always want because of the SEC requirements.
yeah.
But you don't see that until you get to the end of the board bio. And frankly, a lot of people aren't going to get that far.
Mhm.
Um,
No,
where
you're right.
they have experience in. I read a board bio not too long ago where they said they have a lot of experience in artificial intelligence. It was in the fifth paragraph,
Mhm.
and I'm saying this may be, a transitory phenomenon, but if you've got AI experience, people want you and they want you now. Don't bury that at the end because people aren't going to read that far.
No, not at all. And
But it also goes to the cocktail party, the elevator speech, whatever you're referring to. You've got a finite amount of time to get out your value proposition and how you can really help a board.
that's a very important point because that's a very first thing that we do, especially in our board member masterminds, is we actually do have an exercise where every single participant actually takes the time to write things down when it comes to what are the top 3 skills that you bring to the table, what are the top 3 things that you want to be known for. And that's all boils down to the type of brand that you want to build as a board director, as a board member.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
prime examples when it comes to, joining, for example, a nonprofit board. If you don't have that experience, get a little bit of that skill set, what it takes in terms of just the overall basics of the board structure, board organization, and then expose yourself. At the end of the day, where you're talking about networking and a lot of that, putting yourself in a situation where you could have potentially a conversation with someone who could be looking for a great qualified, board member with a given skill set that you bring to the table. That's a very interesting topic, and we could probably have a whole separate podcast
Oh, yeah,
dedicated
yeah.
to it.
Well, but imagine, if you posit the situation I mentioned before, you're on a nonprofit board with a bank president, and by the way, do your homework and find out what other boards she's on. Um, so you find out she's on the board of a startup that's food delivery. I don't know, make it up as you go along.
Right.
Well, you know, if you know what other boards she's on, you can say, hey, I saw that you're on the board of XYZ food company. I happen to have a degree in nutrition,
Yeah.
and I have a lot of thoughts about how a food company might, whatever it is. I mean,
Mhm.
maybe it's a lousy example because I thought of it on short notice, but I said before you have to do your homework, but you have to do your homework to get on a board too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And read this. This sounds terrible. Read proxy statements. Not every proxy statement, but if there's a company for which you think you're good, look at their proxy statement. Find out if there are directors who have been there for a long time or who are in their 70s or 80s. That may be an opportunity for you. Maybe not today, but maybe tomorrow.
Right.
and follow them and let them know what your strengths are.
Mhm.
So I think there's a lot you can do. It's still not easy. It's not like snapping your fingers and the genie comes out and it points you to a board. Um,
Yeah,
maybe
exactly.
that's mixing metaphors. You should rub the lantern, but whatever.
Yeah, you could try that as a strategy.
You know,
Yeah, and that's
but
a delicate conversation, because as I talk to a lot of executives, and unfortunately, not a lot of times that I hear a very clear strategy when it comes to just outlining some type of a plan for yourself, what it takes to secure that first board seat. It's just like securing your first job. You need to have a plan. You need to have a timeline. You need to have maybe even your own personal board of directors who will help you to get to that next stage.
no, exactly. And
Yeah.
a lot of it all takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. I mean, one of the people I've met along the way is a woman with a law degree who's Latina. And she thought for sure she'd be snapped up on a board, and she should have been because she's really smart and very articulate. But when I saw her, she was like really despondent, like I've been doing this for 2 years and not even a nibble.
Yeah.
And I said, stick with it because you've got the skills. And maybe it's the way you're conveying your message, but the more you convey the message, the better you'll get at it. And
Yeah.
the next time I saw her, because I don't see her every day, you know, she was on 2 boards and had a pending offer to join a third.
Wow.
So, it
That's great.
takes time and it takes effort, but if that's what you want, you got to go for it.
Yeah. Bob, in closure of our conversation, maybe can you share some your content diet? What do you consume on daily basis? Well, not on daily basis, but what's the most insightful resource for you when it comes to just overall all things boards, board opportunities and things like that, or just keeping yourself
Wow,
entertained and informed?
that's a hard question. I mean, first of all, well, I'm a voracious reader. I read novels, I read nonfiction, I read everything, and I
Well,
find
tell us how many books a year you read. It blew my mind.
I usually read about 50 or 60 books a year. Well, that includes audiobooks. So
Wow.
maybe that's cheating a little bit.
Those are
Um,
crazy numbers.
but no, sitting down with a good book is great for me. And I don't use an e-reader most of the time. I'm
Uh-huh.
very old fashioned, but then I found out that Bill Gates also likes real books. So I don't feel like the Philistine that I probably
He
am.
goes on these weird retreats by himself to like some cabin
Yeah,
or on
yeah.
Netflix.
I mean, I this is going to sound really cheesy, and I haven't really thought about it from that point of view before, John. But I think really reading the newspapers and reading about, I mean, corporate governance and the role of boards is in the news every single day.
Yeah.
Um, this week it's Tesla resubmitting Elon Musk's crazy pay package for a second shareholder vote.
Mhm.
It's Boeing with all the problems Boeing has had.
Mhm.
It's not today, but a few years ago, McDonald's, which lost a series of CEOs in very strange circumstances. There's something going on in that world all the time. Um, and you can learn a lot from how those boards behave when they're faced with these different problems. There's also actually a lot of good books. Not, I'm not a big advocate of self-help books because they may or may not apply to you. I will say, that I'm a big fan of Adam Epstein, and he's written a book. I think it's called The Perfect Corporate Board.
Uh-huh.
Um, and it's a great read, and it's not unduly long. That's one. But I would also read books about some of the great corporate crises. Um, Barbarians at the Gate. It's an oldie but goodie.
Yeah.
Um,
That's a good one.
there's a great book by James Stewart called The Disney Wars,
Mhm.
about all the stuff that was going on at Disney way back when Michael Eisner hired and then fired Michael Ovitz and all the stuff that the board got into.
Mhm.
Stewart may want to write a new book about what's been going on at Disney lately, but these are like sort of corporate America's equivalent of the soap opera,
Right.
and they're fascinating stories.
Mhm.
And you may not learn what to do, but you certainly, in some cases, will learn what not to do.
Yeah.
And they're great reads. I mean, they're as good as any mystery, for me at least, that you could possibly want to get your hands on. So that I
Yeah.
think it makes you a much more well-rounded person. And like I said, I'm not a big fan of self-help books. Adam's book is not really a self-help book. It's much more a book about his observations,
Yeah.
what he's seen of boards.
Mhm.
His blog is also phenomenal. There are a number of good blogs out there about corporate America that are worth following.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff that you can get your hands on today.
No, for sure. Those are great recommendations.
And podcasts. We
Yeah.
must never forget podcasts.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely podcasts as well, and we'll make those titles and the things that you've mentioned in the show notes of this episode, so people can definitely check that out. But I can't thank you enough for your time today. I know it was a very short and insightful conversation.
Oh, you are very kind, and as I said to you, I love this stuff. So
Yeah, in
I
full
hope
disclosure, I
you
always
call
say
on
that
me again.
I do these podcasts because I personally learned so much from them. So I definitely appreciate your time. I'm definitely looking forward to connecting with you soon, hopefully in one of our board masterminds as well. So I
Great,
really
excellent, excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, John. I appreciate it.